Good afternoon to the August 23rd meeting of the Committee to Review and Assess Zoning and Review the Town's Use of Regulatory Agreements. I think we'll go ahead and start with roll call.
Members of the committee, Councilor Jeffrey Mendez, Councilor Matthew Levesque, Councilor John Crow.
Here.
Councilor Kristen Turkelson.
Here.
Councilor Charlie Bloom.
Here.
Catherine Leduc.
Here.
Ken Alsman. Seth Entienne, and Chair of Committee Bob Schulte.
Here.
You have quorum.
Thank you. Start by making an announcement. In accordance with MGL Chapter 30A, Section 20, I must inquire whether anyone is recording this meeting, and if so, to please make your presence known. I think we're good there. Just recite again the purpose of this committee, which is to work with the town's planning and development staff to review and reassess recently adopted zoning changes, review the town's use of regulatory agreements, and make recommendations to the town council. Just start with a quick intro. Once again, want to thank everyone, both here in person or watching on Zoom, for your interest in the committee and its work. Once again, we encourage the public to provide input and comments either in person, via Zoom, or by email. Email should be sent to Cynthia Lovell at Cynthia, CYNTHIA.Lovell, LOVELL, at town.barnstable.ma.us. And please note in the subject line, Ad Hoc Zoning and Regulatory Review Committee. I think with that, we can move to correspondence to the committee. Item B. We received several emails since our last meeting. One from Andrea Good regarding concerns on the solar overlay at 810 Wakeby Road. We received an email from Chris Kuhn with details of the number of applications to build apartments in Barnstable, expressing his concerns about whether the type of affordable housing the town really needs is what is being proposed to be built. Received an email from Larry Morin. Mr. Morin had several specific questions regarding Chapter 168, regulatory agreements, and asked for some written follow-up. Mr. Morin's here today. I'm going to review that with Mr. Kupfer to get his help in putting together some response to some of the questions Mr. Morin asked in his email. And I also received an email which asked Cynthia to forward to all of the committee members from Brian Florence, Director of Inspectional Services, in which he asked Cynthia, or which he offered to make a presentation on zoning enforcement to the committee. I told him that we had been discussing having him in for a presentation, and we felt that it was important to hear from him, and we would schedule that in the near future when we talk about some of our meetings in September. Maybe we can get some input from Jim on what the agendas are going to look like, and we'll get Mr. Florence on one of those as well. We can move to item C, which is public comment. Before we start public comment, just a reminder to those who are on Zoom, following the closing of public comment, the Zoom link will be turned off, so there'll be no access to Zoom or further comments once the public comment session ends. So I'll start with anybody in the room that would like to speak public comment. Okay. Oh, Mr. Morin.
Thank you, Bob. Larry Morin from Cotuit. I appreciate you letting me submit things. I've also submitted some ideas through Jim about enforcement. And I think that when the time comes to get Brian Flores in here, it might make a very interesting discussion about how enforcement should be even something you have to deal with. But anyway, so it's the only loose end of the tail at the moment. And I'm here today just to listen and see what happens.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. I'll ask to see if we have any members of the public on Zoom that would like to comment today.
There is nobody on Zoom currently right now.
Okay. All right. Then we will close the public comment. Anybody have any responses to Mr. Morin? Or Committee Member Leduc?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much, Larry, for coming tonight, and thank you for submitting your comments. I just wanted to make a brief comment about enforcement. While that specifically, in my mind, is not part of the committee's review, when there are challenges with enforcement activities out there, those are indicators to me that there may be opportunities to improve language in the zoning ordinance, because they're actually out there enforcing the regulations within the zoning ordinance, and if there are problems enforcing that, or there are challenges, or the enforcement takes a really long time, it's just an indicator of a section of the ordinance that we might need to look at and make sure that it's as clear as it needs to be. I just wanted to share that brief comment. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councilor Trickelson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank Larry for taking his time to, with a fine-tooth comb, go through our documents and make recommendations. I'm obviously not an expert in those things, so hopefully our experts can help us marry those two things together, what you see and what we have already. And I appreciate the comments about the solar overlay, just because it's something that could happen, you know, to the left and right of us, and we just want to be proactive rather than reactive. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I think we'll move to items D and E. Jim, we'll ask you to join us at the podium or table, whatever is most comfortable for you. The first was really a discussion of any follow-up to some of the revisions we discussed on the draft memo of Chapter 168 amendments. I don't think there's a whole lot there, but Jim, there might have been a few things you wanted to cover with us, and then maybe after that, give us an update on the Great Streets presentation. I'm hoping that Mr. Alsman will be here soon, because I know that was one of the things he was interested in. I think he's running a little bit late.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Jim Kupfer, Director of Planning. Yes, there wasn't a ton of substance added to the memo. The only true track change added was the insertion of under enforcement, where we suggest inserting performance bonds. I've added language based on the discussion for and/or conservation bonds. That's the only substantive change to the memo. I'm not sure if you guys actually received the draft, but I can hand those out to you. It's literally just that one line, though. In addition, I believe, Mr. Chairman, you were interested in knowing timing under regulatory agreements. So while I didn't add it to the memo, we can discuss it briefly here if you'd like. So under Chapter 168, the negotiation between the town and an eligible applicant is meant to be conducted within 60 days. So it's phrased here that the public hearings regarding review of a regulatory agreement shall not exceed 60 days. And I'm sorry, let me quote the section first.
Where are you reading? I'm sorry.
Yep. So under 168-8 of the Regulatory Agreement Ordinance, under subsection C, it begins with the town of Barnstable shall assume, but then towards the end of section C, it highlights the length of time. And so the town of Barnstable shall hold at least 2 public hearings, and the public hearings regarding review of regulatory agreement shall not exceed 60 days.
Jim, I'm sorry. Are you looking at the actual, that wasn't in the memo?
No.
We're looking at? Okay.
No, sorry. So the memo itself, the only substantive change, again, was that just the addition of and/or conservation bonds under enforcement. But subsequently, I believe the chair, you had asked for a discussion about timing of regulatory agreements. So I thought I'd offer that, unless there's any suggestions on the memo, if you'd like to address that first.
Kath, do you have a question, comment, Kathy? Okay.
Yeah, I can ask later.
Okay, I think I understand. So if you have a copy of mine, so you're looking at the actual section again, it's the regulatory agreement. Is, again, I'm sorry, Jim, so it's 168,
Yep, not a problem. So 168-8,
okay,
under subsection C, it refers you to the timing, and I can wait a moment.
okay, I see it.
So towards the end of subsection C there, it talks about that the town must hold 2 public hearings, and those hearings, the review of a regulatory agreement during those hearings shall not exceed 60 days unless mutually agreed by both parties. So that's typical language you'll see for permitting, like special permits, site plans, et cetera. However, the unique part about regulatory agreements is this next line here. So failure to close the public hearings within 60 days shall not result in a constructive grant of the proposed development. So that really what that's saying there is, in a typical permit structure, a town has their obligations and duties to hear an application in a timely manner. This is an optional contract between 2 parties. So it gives more discretion to the town and says that, if truly this isn't heard within 60 days, it isn't, in fact, approved, they must continue to seek the proper approvals per the ordinance. And so that's critical because, again, this is an optional contract between both parties. And I would say in a typical agreement, looking back at some of the files, the application gets filed, but then again, as we had mentioned, there's early conversations between maybe the planning board chair, the town council president, and if we were to work in early suggested timelines in terms of presentation to the council, we could do that. We could ultimately do this. So some of your suggested early presentations to the council could be achieved without running afoul of the timeline as well.
I think that's helpful, Jim. I think, and it may have been the way I phrased the question, and I apologize if it was confusing. I think my thoughts were, when I talked about timing was, for example, in a regulatory agreement, let's say there are 15 conditions that the developer agrees to as part of that. Is the agreement a 10-year agreement, and at the end of 10 years, you can do whatever you want? If it says, I'm going to restrict the property in some way, or I'm going to do something, do those conditions outlive the 10 years? Is that to another owner? Or that's what I was getting to when I meant
see.
as far as the timing. And does that vary from regulatory to agreement to agreement? Just how does the timing on the conditions that are instituted for the developer, how do those work?
Yep, absolutely. I can speak to that, not a problem. So in terms of the contract itself, there is a 10-year time frame for the execution of the contract. So we've actually had a few contracts that were approved, a few regulatory agreements that have been approved and then have not proceeded. So, and that 10-year timeline has expired. So that contract is null and void at this point. However, if it is within the 10 years and they have achieved the contract or agreement, and there are conditions spelled out, it is specific to those conditions, but they would run with the project, the land. So, if, for instance, an owner changed hands of a property, those conditions would still run with the project, run with the land. So if there is a condition for, let's just say, X number of parking spaces to be maintained and a minimum X number of parking spaces, they cannot reduce those number of parking spaces without coming back to modify the agreement or something to that effect. So that would be one example, but there are a number of different.
So they would run with the land, so would that be just for the 10-year period? Or at the end of 10 years, can they cut the parking spaces in half?
No, exactly. So they would continue, it would continue on with the project itself unless they so choose to abandon that use, abandon the development. We haven't experienced that at this time. So no, the conditions would run with the property. It would be really written, it would be important to be precise with the language of the agreement. So we would have to look at it a case-by-case basis because some language could allow for, say, landscaping to be completed and maintained for X number of years, or it could be in perpetuity. So it would be specific to the language. But the agreement is meant to run with the project, run with the land.
And I think, I don't know what others have heard, but I know one of the things I've heard is that creates kind of a dilemma, 5-6 years down the road. people forget about that regulatory agreement, and then that landscaping that was promised disappears, or the parking is cut in half and nobody really remembers that. And again, since that's not really an enforcement, something that our enforcement group would do, there really isn't anybody that's going out and saying, hey, you know, the developer agreed to these things. So that's the $64,000 question. How do you, you know, enforce or make sure those things are lived up to?
Exactly, and I think that returns back to the conversation that this group has had about enforcement, improving those agreements, talking about conservation bonds, talking about performance bonds, and those could, you know, exceed the execution of the plan. So, for instance, a conservation bond might last, you know, for 30 years, so that, you know, we can have some assurances that, you know, that landscaping is taking and flourishing.
Okay. Questions, thoughts? Kathy, I see something on your mind?
Yeah, that's a really important comment about these community benefits going beyond the time frame of the contract. So what I'm thinking about is, you know, once a project is completed, depends on what the project is, of course, but there might be a management company that is hired to manage the day-to-day needs of that property. It depends on what kind of project we're talking about, of course, but let's just assume in some instances there might be a management company that's hired, and within the text of the agreement, the regulatory agreement, you could put a clause in there that says, if you enter into any agreements with a management company to manage your land, these are some of the things that need to be included in that. That's an option.
That's great verbiage there, as well as some more recent agreements we've added that change of ownership. You must notify, and that notification is really so that we can reiterate the conditions back to the new owner.
You said it runs with the land, right?
Correct. So the agreement is read. So if change of ownership again, it would be, you know, you're coming forward and explaining that you have this agreement, and it wouldn't dissolve unless you so chose to, you know, move on from this agreement. You have a different development that you're looking to do, perhaps something to that.
If it's 15 years, let's say it's 15 years, right? 10 years is the length of the regulatory agreement. So let's say, I'm just making this up as I go, 20 years from now, the owner decides they want to sell the property, right? It's beyond the term of the agreement. It no longer runs with the land, isn't that correct?
No, so the 10 years is the time to execute the agreement. So,
Okay.
for instance, if you wanted to build a CVS
Right.
and you didn't build that CVS,
Yeah.
you have 10 years to build the CVS.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so once you've achieved that, now you have your agreement. Because the unique part about this, again, is our first discussion was these agreements are not zoning. So
Right.
now you're not in compliance with zoning if you're not upholding your agreement, right?
Okay,
So
right.
so
That's right.
so this agreement is that's what I mean by running with the land, running with the project, and you have that 10 years to execute your agreement.
Okay, well, that's certainly something to give consideration to. Councilor Turkelson.
The 10 years to execute the agreement, on average, how long does it take a project to execute a regulatory agreement?
It's a good question.
Like 10 years seems like a long time to get something done.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like that seems very generous.
And yet some have still decided to let it expire. Maybe they moved on from the project, perhaps, but yeah, I would estimate a few years to to execute an agreement like this.
And where did we come up with this 10-year
This is part of the
Cape Cod Commission?
Correct,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So maybe it's, yeah, that makes more sense, I
and you
guess.
could certainly be more stringent if you so chose.
I don't know. I think I missed that piece until we were having this conversation, and it seems like 10 years is a long time to, fish and cut bait.
And I'd have to go back and relook at the whole section. Jim, you probably know off the top of your head, but is there any language in 168, a paragraph that talks a little bit more about that makes that clear to the developers, that those requirements and conditions go beyond the 10-year execution period and for the life of the project?
I would say not necessarily, no. So the 10 years is specified in 168-9 under limitations of a regulatory agreement. The specificity of the conditions, I would have to take a closer look and get back to you on that one.
Okay, I would just suggest that maybe we consider as an addition to the memo that there be some language inserted into that, because I can certainly see if I'm a developer and there's no paragraph in there that explains to me that, you know, I'm obligated to maintain these conditions and do what I was promised beyond 10 years, at least have it in writing so the town can go back and say, hey, if there's a particular problem, this is part of the agreement. Right now, it's kind of vague, so at least in my mind. Councilor Crowe.
And also put in something about the fact that these are, the subsequent owner is subject to these same regulations.
Any other thoughts or questions then on the memo? Okay. Kathy?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So after reviewing the memo, there's something that I had brought up a couple of meetings ago that's not in here, and it may be that it wasn't a great idea, but I want to just confirm, you know, that it's not in there for a reason and we didn't forget about it. So in my reading of all these regulatory agreements, you know, we had 5 or 6 of them to look at. What really struck me is how different the language is in each one of those. And of course, my understanding now is that these are written by the attorneys who are working for the owner, the property owner, or the developer of the site. So, but they're coming to us in a negotiation, and it seems to me that there should be an opportunity for us to kind of standardize some of the language in these agreements. I found them to be very different, and in some cases more detailed in some of the legal language than in others. And it just seems like, so we have 24 regulatory agreements right now, and it just seems to me like there's an opportunity there for us to review the language in all of them, perhaps finesse it a little bit and come up with some standard language that would be applicable for regulatory agreements to kind of standardize the process. One of the concerns that I have is in assessing the success of a regulatory agreement, we need to make sure that the public benefits that are defined are easy to measure. So if you have language in one regulatory agreement that's different from another one, and they're measuring apples to oranges, it's really hard for you to say, you know, that they really accomplished what it is that you wanted them to accomplish. So what I'm getting at is making it really easy for us to monitor the success of the agreements. And if we have some standard language that the staff can draw from that's been successful, because we've got 24 examples to look at, if we can come up with that language and a specific list of the public benefits that we're looking for, if we have a not so creative property owner or a developer come in that wants to enter into a regulatory agreement and maybe they missed a few public benefits, maybe we can get a few more public benefits from the agreement. So I'm just wondering, that didn't really get into the agreement, and I see Steve in the audience. Thank you for being here today. I just wonder if it wasn't a good idea. If you didn't think it was a good idea to do that, I'm not sure. Please, it's an open discussion, for sure.
Yeah, we certainly added, so the public benefit aspect of it, I think we had a long discussion about how that gets defined. And ultimately, I believe that resided in the defined public benefit section, where we look to the council for recommendations annually about what the public benefit of our community should be. Excuse me. In terms of template, we could certainly add that to it. You're right, they kind of vary in the examples that were provided. That is 20 plus years of agreements, and so that's likely many different attorneys. And no offense to Attorney Connolly, I've never given an agreement to an attorney that hasn't been changed slightly. Sure. But we could certainly work on a template, absolutely, with legal's help.
That's a good point, Kathy. I guess I have a question for you. I just understand the process more. Is that the nature of the beast, that it changes a lot? And maybe Attorney Connolly has some thoughts too. What is the process, Jim, when someone comes? Is it typically the attorney for the developer brings you the agreement? Do you start out? Doesn't sound like you have a template. I would think it would be easier for you and our legal department if we started at least with a template, and then there may be addendums that are specific to the project. I understand the need to vary, but it does seem like there would be 10, 12 sections that would be pretty standard from project to project. Thinking about easing your workload, our legal departments, if you knew that you were starting out with a template or a basis. So what's the process?
It would be great to have a standardized template, and we could certainly work on that to have it on the website so someone could pull it and work directly from it. Really what happens to date practically is that the most recent successful one that our attorneys have reviewed, we offer that in Word form for them to manipulate that, to make it for their own, and then the current attorneys will take a look at it to see how it reflects the present day legal issues.
Councilor Turkelson.
I think that the standardization of this process is really important if we want to be able to monitor our results over time. I deal in data every day, so we have a standardized way we write a treatment note. We have a standard way we measure range of motion. We have a standard way we measure strength. We have standardized tools, and literally somebody could walk into our clinic and ask me for the last 100 patients who came for back pain, and they'd be able to collect the data and assess our effectiveness. So I think to even have it on our website is a good idea, but I think we would want to make that sort of more of a requirement, because if we don't take the data today and we don't have those same data points for the next 5 agreements, it's just no point in having it. So I think we either need to maybe think about moving to, I don't know if Attorney Connolly has any thought on that, but it almost seems like they're still driving the bus rather than us driving the bus and us saying we want these 12 things as a general starting point, and then we're asking for more, they're asking for more, they're giving more, and then there's a bargaining. So it just seems odd to me that we're not. Again, it seems more reactive than proactive, but I'm also not a developer and I'm not a lawyer.
Do you mind if I offer something?
Absolutely.
Steve Robichaud, Chair of the Planning Board. This standardization definitely exists. As members, we see the same language and the same paragraphs in all of these agreements, but you're right, that should be more formalized and put out there so people are aware of it. I'll just, mention one thing. There are limitations to the standardization, just because you may have an applicant looking to do a regulatory agreement for a coffee shop. The next one could be a car wash. The next one could be housing. So that's why you do get a lot of variations. But absolutely, there's those standardized paragraphs that we see in every one that definitely could be made into a formal template. But again, to Jim's credit, I think staff does a great job of having that standardization. It's just not formal. You know what I mean? So we see the same paragraphs in all of these. They all kind of end the same way with the same terms, but certainly it could be a little bit more formal, definitely. Yeah.
Just a couple of comments drawn on my personal experience in almost 30 years negotiating contracts and engagements. One of the risks of handing your most recent engagement letter is sometimes there are hard-fought provisions you put into, you agree to. You give that to the next person, they say, well, they got that, I want that. When you start with a more basic template, let them come back and say, this is what I want. Don't give them examples of all the things you're willing to, after a hard-fought battle, agree to right out of the box. So that's one of the advantages, I think, to using more of a template. Understanding, Steve, that clearly there are going to be certain things that are in everyone, but there are things that you will not see or you may not want to give them right out of the box. The second thing goes to some of the comments that Ken has made, that by having more of the template, you're starting off giving the developer, this is what you expect to see. Again, some of the being proactive versus then reactive and stuff. So just some thoughts. So maybe we add something to the memo about that consideration of establishing some sort of a standard template that would be maybe the basis for regulatory agreements, understanding each one is going to be unique after negotiations and discussions.
keep in mind, too, all of the existing regulatory agreements are in the public domain. So, I mean, any applicant does have access to all of the existing ones.
Oh, good point.
Yeah, that's all.
Although I should be surprised at how many of them don't bother to look at them, but
Oh,
maybe
you're
their
right.
attorneys do.
That's a good point. You're right. That's a good point. So, thank you.
Each regulatory agreement that I read was better than the one I read before. But what was interesting was the regulatory agreement that I liked, which was much more detailed, was from, I think it was 2018 or 2019. I found that one to be better than one that was newer. So I guess it kind of depends on the situation. You know, I just think that we should sort of remember that we're in the driver's seat. They're looking to us to, in many ways, give them opportunities to not follow some things in the zoning ordinance. So I think that we're in the driver's seat, so that gives us an opportunity to really drive the conversation a little more strongly, perhaps.
I just want to, thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to pause for 1 second and welcome our new committee member, Seth Etienne. Seth, I'm sorry if there's confusion. We were thinking this meeting would start at 3. The next meeting in September would start at 3:30, so apologize for the confusion. Thank you. No. I was late as well. So we're on item D on the agenda. Mr. Moran was our only public commenter. So other than roll call and introductions, you haven't missed a lot. So, but welcome. We're happy to have you join the committee and looking forward to your contributions. So unless there's any other thoughts on the memo and comments, maybe we'll ask Jim. We asked last time, I think Ken asked for maybe, mentioned it, a brief presentation on the Great Streets project, just so that we get a little bit better understanding it's really outside of our scope, but it probably has some impact on some of the things we'll be looking at when we get to downtown Hyannis and some of the zoning, so.
Absolutely. I'll just pull it up. Just give me 1 sec.
Okay, that's great. Oh, sort of forgot.
All right. So thank you. Yes, at the last meeting, there was a discussion about presenting on the Great Streets Downtown Hyannis project. This is a great opportunity for me because doing a dry run, we'll be having a formal presentation with the council in 2 weeks. But this will be a sneak peek of the presentation. So just as a reminder, the Great Streets project, you know, this was started back late 2022 into 2023, and the discussion was, you know, how can we improve the safety of downtown Hyannis on Main Street predominantly, but also thinking about its surrounding network, meaning the side streets that essentially connect Main Street to South Street and South Street as well. And so the discussion led us to a two-way Main Street, a two-way South Street. Just a reminder that this project and suggested changes to Main Street and South Street are not meant to really move traffic quickly in and through downtown Hyannis. That's essentially what exists today for the most part. Double-barrel, one-way roads that go west and east. And it's predominantly focused on trying to get vehicles east and west. And, you know, one of the things we heard over and over again, and what the council has heard during public comment over the past months, is, you know, we need to give priority to our Main Street, make it a place that for people, make it a place for people that can safely cross the street and enjoy our community, our historic Main Street, and its surrounding neighborhood. So the project goals there was to enhance the public realm, as I just mentioned, prioritize people walking, address potential congestion from increased residential, employ traffic calming enhancements, and encourage multimodal transportation. So those are all fancy words to say that we looked at two-way Main Street. Two-way Main Street and in the network, two-way South Street is as it's shown on that map there. Side streets are already two-way, North Street's already two-way, Pleasant Street, Lewis Bay already two-way. So this essentially creates that full network of now two-way Main Street, South Street. Important to note, with a few exceptions of our 6 Points intersection, which is South Street, where it comes into Ocean, Old Colony, and I'll go over it, but where Main Street and South Street come together towards the west. With the exception of those two locations, there is no curb movement. So the width of the road is the width of the road. There's no substantial construction for the vast majority of this project. The curb lines will stay. It's really lines and signs, so repainting of the way and adding stop signs. And when I mean stop signs, we're adding a lot of new four-way intersections with two-way Main Street and two-way South Street. So stop signs will be distributed out as you see there, with a few exceptions. Again, some predominant or dominant intersections, that being again 6 Points intersection, which is a tiny little circle. That's the roundabout, and Center Street remains a light at this time, as well as down over at Lewis Bay. So this doesn't work all that well, but so on this map, to the west is the West End Rotary, so to the left of the screen is the West End Rotary. To the right, we're over towards Yarmouth Road there. So Main Street is that spine that goes right down the middle. South Street, obviously, to the south of Main Street. Add some four-way stops. This is, a major safety improvement, as I'm sure many of you that come from the west coming to Town Hall will inadvertently drive fast. It's built that way for you to drive fast. Many times, especially at High School Road Extension in South Street, many people stop, even though there's no stop sign, just because it makes sense to stop there. There's so much concerns for turning movements and so many pedestrians in that area that we see a lot of times traffic just stopping voluntarily without a stop sign there. So this really seeks to create a much more safe environment for our downtown Hyannis, a place where we can visit, we can spend our full day walking and enjoying our downtown. The changes to the curb lines that I mentioned. So as we saw here, vast majority of this map here, there will be no width changes, no curb line changes, just lines and signs, repainting of the way, and adding stop signs to appropriate locations, with two exceptions. One being the top portion there, and that is Main Street and South Street. So as you're coming west from the left of that page and you're entering into Hyannis, there will be a new orientation so that you go down South Street and you can go down Main Street. So right now, as you enter downtown Hyannis, you are not welcome to Main Street. You are forced down South Street, and you have to know when the appropriate time is to turn to get onto Main Street. This will expand green space near 525 South Street, which was a very problem address for safety. So this will actually add some nice green space and slow traffic at that location, and allow for you to go in both directions on Main Street and South Street. The other section is, again, 6 Points intersection. So this is proposed. So before I get to what is proposed, this is why when I say just lines and signs and we're moving curb lines, this curb line is what's taking a little bit longer. And I hear the public who wants to get it done now. I would love to get it done now, too. When we first unveiled the 6 Points, the two-way Main Street, this was looked at as a more temporary roundabout, a very small, very temporarily constructed. And when we met with, stakeholders being the neighborhood nearby, the fire chief, steamship authority, who has very large vehicles going through there was a lot of concern about that temporary design. So we stopped. We said, let's take a closer look at this and let's do it right. The whole project is about trying to create that space of safety and inviting to our downtown. So let's do this right, and that's what the culmination of 6 Points intersection is. It's designed as a roundabout. It's designed for the largest vehicle to go through there, and that largest vehicle is actually the vehicle that can get onto the Steamship Authority's auto ferry. So we took the largest template that they have, which is larger than our fire truck, larger than a F-150 with a big boat behind it, and we made sure that it could facilitate the movements of that. And it shows a closing of the redundant leg of Old Colony and a slip lane for the right onto Old Colony. And so this is what that would look like. I had a lot of good conversations with individuals in the neighborhoods in and around the area about what could be improved or what scale is this truly at, because when you take a look at it, you can't quite figure that out, and I agree. Someone had mentioned, hey, I just drove through the Bourne Rotary. That's a disaster. This is not the Bourne Rotary by any stretch of the imagination. This is one lane, so this is smaller than the Airport Rotary. It's likely slightly smaller than the one over at the Hyannis Youth and Community Center. So if you're used to going through that, this would be slightly larger than that. And that, again, the reason it's larger is to accommodate those larger vehicles. Again, so it allows for some opportunities for placemaking. It allows for increased safety. It allows for continued motion. As someone who frequents this intersection very often, I can't count the number of times I'm sitting at the stoplight and no one's there. Yes, it is busy at our peak season, but boy, is it empty when it's not peak. And so being able to continually move through there, not just but public safety is a vast improvement. And also the bottom left of this page there, where it's kind of grayed out, that is where Old Colony is proposed to be removed, and that's going to be a full green space now. So that will be more green space for our downtown Hyannis. Improves our connectivity to the Village Green, to Main Street, down to the harbor, and open up an economic opportunity too, right in the center of the roundabout. This is what it would look like. This is what it looks like right now coming down Ocean Street as you go towards the harbor. Lots of, and I didn't pay those people to stand in that picture. This is just Google Street View. Those people are lost in the middle of that intersection. And that's a common occurrence. It's a mess trying to get through that intersection, and honestly, it's shameful. We have a lot of people coming from the transportation center, walking down to the harbor, the ferries, and they're aimlessly having to come through this intersection as it looks like today. As it's proposed with the roundabout, that center pole is removed. We've worked with utilities to try and get that out of the image. That opens up our view shed for the harbor. So as you're going down gradient on Ocean Street, it really opens up and could create a real wow that you're entering the harbor. So real opportunities here. We've been working with our stakeholders, being the residents, the emergency services, the Steamship Authority and the High Line, and others, to try and get this right. And I think we're really close. We're currently finishing up design, and we are back before the town council in 2 weeks, approximately, to present just this. A couple other just brief details. There is shown that lighter green is what could be a bike or a shared use path. That is a detail we probably want to continue to discuss more. I always hate putting a shared use path to nowhere. So thinking about how that plays out. And I do want to reiterate, this is the next phase, and there's so many more phases and so many more opportunities we can do to build off of this. Old Colony itself going towards the transportation center, while the width isn't being changed by this, we are changing it to allow for 2 ways. It's so wide that we could really create this really nice walkable corridor from the transportation center down to the harbor. It's not part of this specific project, but could be a great opportunity into the future, and so many more others. The Center Street intersection is another project in and of itself that we could really do great things with. So with that, our next steps, as I mentioned, trying to finalize our design, finalizing utilities. So many poles out there. We gotta discuss with all the carriers that are on the poles. We hand this off in our typical fashion to DPW. DPW will go back out to the public for our 75% design of 6 Points intersection to get further feedback and develop out that finalized communication plan. And then ultimately, if successful, implement our $1.8 million MassWorks grant leveraging our Chapter 90 funding. Schedule. This is what it looks like, fairly conservative. Design complete maybe hopefully in March. If that is achieved, we could open up bids approximately 2 months later. Obviously not constructing any of this during the peak season, so we'd be waiting till after peak season, whether that's maybe even October as opposed to September. But it is, as I mentioned, vast majority of this project is lines and signs. That's a quick turnaround. It's really the implementation of this 6 Points intersection that will just take a little bit more time. This is just a little bit more detail there. With that, happy to answer any questions.
Councilor Crowe?
Thank you, Bob. Jim, the shorthand for WB 62 and WB 70, I think it was. Is that the length of the tractor trailer? 70 foot? Is that would be able to go through here?
Correct. Yeah. So it's a very large vehicle.
Long, yeah.
And yes, it works with the turning movement of it. So we run it's a program that our engineering office has that we run those and we confirm that the wheels can stay in the area. Yes.
Great. Thanks.
Kathy?
Seemed a little narrow to me for those trucks. It seemed that's just my impression. It seemed a little narrow to me. But I understand the models that you run. I understand that. Can we make it a little bigger just to make sure?
That's the play that we do, the pull and tug and pull, because we want to keep it pedestrian focused.
Right.
We want to keep that neighborhood feel. So yeah, we do try to play with it. What isn't really reflected in this 2D is that the green circle in the center is the raised, and there will likely be like a nice wall around it so you can have landscaping or a statue if you want or something. But that gray in the middle, the gray circle in the middle, will be at ground level. So it'll be like, we could talk about as part of 75% design, we'll be talking about design. Could be brick, it could be cobblestone, it could be whatever you like. So that will be allowed to be driven over by the very large vehicles.
That's like over near the Hyannis Youth Center. That rotary has the kind of
Very similar, yep,
ridged
exactly right.
concrete at street level. Okay.
I love the pedestrian-friendly approach. It's really difficult to walk through that area. I would love the utilities to be underground, because then you would have a beautiful view of the harbor as you're walking down the hill from the transportation center. Of course, I just figured I'd start introducing the topic.
I had that same conversation with utilities, and they looked at me like I was crazy.
Yeah.
This is the main trunk line for the hospital, so there's so many utilities on there. I didn't ask what the cost would be. We continued on with our site walk.
Ken?
Yeah, I just want to say I think this is going to has the potential of being a really great improvement for the downtown. It's the kind of thing that I've worked on in the past in the community where I worked. And you also know I have some concerns about how projects like this get signed, because usually you'll have beautiful design drawings and sketches, and they'll all be really clear, and then 2 weeks later, Public Works comes in and puts in signs. I've taken a hard look at this over the last several months, and I just think we're going crazy with signs, particularly pedestrian signs. There's a real strong effort to get pedestrian-friendly places. we need to come up with some way of getting pedestrian-friendly signing. Right now, they are too big, too tall, too many, ugly colors, and I think, you know, we can destroy a good environment with them. I have a lot more to say on that, but I appreciate the overview you've given to us. Thank you.
And to be clear on that, I've read Ken's dissertation on signage, and I completely agree. We're not talking about your standard stop sign. We're talking about going well above and beyond with pedestrians this way, blinking lights everywhere, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Charlie?
Jim, I approach everything with a healthy dose of skepticism, and so I needed to be sold, and I am sold. I think this is a great plan. I think it's going to be great for Hyannis, and the safety issue. I like the idea of that. You know, you started this out by saying, you know, we're not doing this to speed traffic along. If anything, we need to slow traffic down, especially at that intersection there that, you know, we have talked about before. You know, 2 people have been killed there, and many people within the last couple of years, 2 people have been killed and many people injured. So this is a great start, I think, to the safety of pedestrians in Hyannis.
Thank you. And I know, Attorney Connolly, we want to make sure we don't go too far afield of our charter, or our charge. But I think it was good just to get some input, and for you as the planning development to hear from some of the citizens and councilors on some of these items and stuff. Just a couple of just comments I have. I'll be honest with you, you know, I focus more on the going from a one-way to a two-way, and I just still have a very difficult time visualizing it. But I spent a lot of time going online trying to find studies to see merits, benefits, pros and cons. And overwhelmingly what I've seen, you know, not just from our consultant, but other bodies of, you know, expertise, all seem to say that this really works. So, you know, like Charlie, I don't know if I say, but convinced, you know, proof will be in the pudding and stuff, but what I've read is good. The other question I had was, you mentioned the funding, 1.8 million and then 2 million. Is that the total cost of this project? Is it all being funded? I mean, that's for everything. It's the restriping, new stop signs to do that intersection. I mean, it seems like that's just to do the roundabout seems like it'd be more than $4 million.
Well, the longer we wait, the more likely it won't cover it, honestly. So we had cost estimates completed from our consultant as they're doing the designs, and they've added it up each year with some, you know, inflation. So right now it does. I believe within the next year it still does, but you know that's an estimate. We'll have to wait till we get the bids in, but we're hopeful that will achieve the total project. Yes.
Any other questions or thoughts for Jim? Yeah. Seth?
Could you go back to the diagram of the section that shows the traffic in both ways? Excellent. I was just kind of curious why there's only one bike lane on South Street and like none on the reverse end. And then when you showed the graphic of the new revised version of the six intersection, the six-way intersection, there is a two-way bike lane on Old Colony, but only one way on South Street still. So, like, what was kind of the thought process behind that?
Yep. Yeah. So it's actually just the width that we have to work with, and honestly, the South Street bike lane is a question mark. You know, we talked with DPW, and both of us agree that if we're not going to do it correctly, we should wait and do it correctly. Right now, this really proposes. Something like, I don't know if you're familiar with like armadillos, little items that you kind of nail down into the road that creates that lane, but it doesn't have that elevation to it. So it's not overly protective. We've really looked at South Street at maybe doing a shared use path like we've done on C Street, or something similar to that. So that might be the model we would prefer to go to, as opposed to, you know, recommending folks use that shoulder when it may not be safe. So, you know, South Street had some limited width. The thought behind this, if we were to proceed with bike lanes, would be it's kind of ironic. We're turning one-way Main Street and one-way South Street two-way, but the bike lane was going to be one-way on South Street and one-way on North Street with the connector loop on Old Colony because there's like 40 feet there to work with. So that's the thought process behind it. It's still kind of a question mark whether we truly put down those bike lanes now or we wait to do it maybe more comprehensively.
That makes sense. It's still excellent.
John?
Thanks, Bob. You were talking possibly at the six-way intersection having a statue or something. Considering all the controversy about statues, how about a just nice fountain with some imagination? That would be good, so we don't have any fights over that.
Understood.
That'd be a big sailboat. Kristen?
I know that you said that the intersection's made for the steamship authority's boat length, but aren't they getting longer boats? So I guess I'm just curious. I mean, maybe that's the end width or length of a truck, potentially. They're getting longer boats, I've heard, so.
Right. We talked directly to the steamship. They gave us their template for the next, I think they have a 5-10-year plan. And so even if the boats are getting larger, my understanding it's for more additional, capacity and maybe not so much larger ones. I can't contemplate how much larger of a truck we need to accommodate. Maybe at some point we just say no more large trucks of a certain length, but we have we're pretty confident that this is going to take care of the largest vehicles coming through here.
And how much, you said that there's going to be a little bit of green space that's created? How much green space is that?
Right. So, we don't have the square footage offhand. I can measure that out. But really what's going on here is on the southwest corner. So there is that green space where the flag is now. And then there's the wide, maybe about 20 to 25 feet of roadway that will be closed off and connected as green space. And then that will connect to the next section of green space. So we'll have a nice grouping of one cohesive green space area, opportunity for additional plantings of some kind or something in that location certainly can be added there. And just to note too, I should have noted in the beginning, Azleton Park, which is to the right, not touched whatsoever. That curb line remains. That was one of the priorities. It's a beautiful area. We don't want to touch that, so that curb line remains.
Well, thank you, Jim. We promise not to give you any changes or grief. We just thank you for indulging the committee's curiosity and interest in the project. So I think it's helpful to know a little bit more about what's going on down there. So with that, thank you. I guess we'll ask Attorney Connolly. Item F, there were several items. One was, I think, the Osterville parking lawsuit. You provided us with some information on Chapter 59, comprehensive occupancy, and then I think you promised to give us an update. Maybe Jim has some input on that as well. The status of the 810 Wakeby project, Wakeby Road project. So thank you.
Oh, now it's on. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kate Connolly, Assistant Town Attorney. To address the first issue, which was that Superior Court parking case that was mentioned by Councilor Crow at one of the previous meetings, I did go to the court and looked at the pleadings. Some of them are available online, but for some reason the entire file wasn't because it's so old, but I found other cases online that are even older, so not really sure what the point there was. But that was a challenge by the property owner, Robert Spellenhauer, of the imposition of a fine or several fines against him for having too many cars outside on his property. And the court found that there were quite a few pleadings and quite a few different motions filed, and it went on and was appealed. The court initially issued an injunction, but after the appeal, bottom line is the appeals court sent it back and said that the Superior Court was wrong in upholding the fines and found that Chapter 59, Section 3B, and I did send around copies of Chapter 59 as it currently exists. You'll see that there is no 3B because it was repealed after the court found that it was invalid. And that's the section. Chapter 59 is comprehensive occupancy. The purpose and intent of the chapter is to guide growth in accordance with the local comprehensive plan, and so on. Definitions, maximum number of occupants in a property. It's that section at the very end regarding the maximum number of motor vehicles that are prohibited, or that are permitted on the property. That's the part that was repealed because essentially the court found that it was invalid. And the reason the court found it invalid is it was a Board of Health regulation, but the court felt that it was use of a property and should properly be a zoning regulation, so it should have been in the zoning ordinance. And it was not. And if it was properly in the zoning ordinance, it would have had to be adopted under Chapter 40A, Section 5, which I read a little bit from last week with respect to who can bring a petition to make a zoning change, and then all of the other many requirements of Section 5 to either adopt or amend a zoning ordinance or bylaw. The court further found that there was no nexus between parking and health, although at the hearings before the Board of Health, I believe it was, and then there might have been a town council hearing, there were some discussions where people sort of started getting towards talking about septic. But Title V, the state septic regulations, don't regulate the number of people. They actually regulate the number of bedrooms. And in any event, the court in this particular case found that nobody made an actual nexus between health and parking, and therefore it should have been a zoning regulation. So that's how that case was resolved, and that's how we left the zoning ordinance. After that section was repealed, we still have 59, but we just don't have that part of it. So I'm happy to answer questions on that, and I can also address your other question about solar.
So, Kate, what you're saying is that we no longer have any restriction on the amount of vehicles on a property unless we decide to zone for that.
That's correct, although we do have, and maybe Brian Florence would be the appropriate person to address Chapter 240, we do have, and thank you for mentioning that, because that's another point that the court made in this case, which was Barnstable has other parking regulations in its zoning ordinance, so the court felt that this should have been in the zoning ordinance as well. So we do regulate parking in Chapter 240 in various ways, according to the zoning district.
But in that 240, do we limit the amount of cars at a house, like say, on how many square feet or bedrooms they have?
I'd have to double
this
check, but
point?
I don't think that we do. I believe that there are certain, not single-family residents, but when we have larger buildings with apartments in them, I believe that those have regulation of how many parking spaces each unit gets. But I don't think we address, I'll take a look at that, but I don't think we address parking for single-family residents.
Okay, that's something I think that we probably have to touch on, because that's where we're having the problems.
Okay.
We're having too many cars in, say, a 3-bedroom house, and there's 8 cars there or something like that. It not only signifies it's overcrowded, but it signifies it's overcrowded, too much occupancy happening, and that affects the septic and everything else. So I think that's what this case was going after at one point. Mm-hmm. But like I said, the guy he had a very small, tiny house and a huge garage behind it with all those cars in it. So I think that was part of it.
Yeah, and then he had other cars outside,
Yes, he did.
just in the driveway. Yeah.
But he had a really tiny salt box and then a big thing behind it. So, like I said, I think we need to address that, because that's important. And we talked about that.
We can
the week
perhaps
before.
talk about that at the next meeting, and I
Yeah.
know Brian
Yeah.
Florence has asked to speak about some other things as well, so he'll be able to address it, but I'll look into it too.
Thank you, Kate. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll follow up. Jim, I'll ask you to make a note of that when we get to the memo on zoning, because I think parking will be an issue. It does sound like that case was very fact-specific, and given some of the repeal and the wording, the law there under the Section 59.3B, maybe the way to look at it is now a suggestion for the town council to look at the zoning to put some sort of parking restrictions in place through zoning, so.
Yeah, in 240 somewhere.
Okay, so we'll, mental note, Jim, for that. Okay. Thank you. I guess that covers both the parking lawsuit, Chapter 59, so the 810 Wakeby Road project. Any updates for us? And again, Jim, I don't know if you have any more. I'm not sure if Ms. Salas was in touch maybe with you, Jim, but maybe an update for us on that.
Sure, and I can sort of address both, but I'll defer to Jim a little bit on the project because he provided me with the information to provide you, which is essentially that project, the status of 810 Wakeby is that they have applied for and received a special permit that has not been appealed. So they're in the process, and they just need to go through the next steps. The separate question that Ms. Salas raised last week, and she did send some further emails that I believe the committee got. I know it was sent to some of you at least. And then I believe, I think Cindy got it and sent it around, asking about whether we could recommend a petition to change the solar, to remove the overlay district, and some other changes, which she didn't specify, at least in the email I saw, but just some other changes. And my response to that is essentially, first I would have to ask, what's the goal of doing that? And with that, if the goal is to stop this particular project, it's not going to stop it. And if the goal is to ban solar from town completely, it's not going to stop that either, because the State Zoning Act, which we talked about a little bit before, allows, under Chapter 40A, which is the State Zoning Act, Section 3, there are certain things that are allowed without, and that can't be prohibited by municipalities, even though municipalities can have more stringent local ordinances or bylaws with respect to certain things that they want to regulate more stringently than the state does. You can't be inconsistent with the state, and if the state preempts something like daycare facilities and schools, and under 48 Section 3, also solar. Daycares are under that same section. But solar is something also that the legislature put a specific provision in the Zoning Act because they want to allow it wherever they can. So municipalities can have overlay districts. They can limit where solar can go in town, and they can put certain restrictions on it, but they've got to be related to health and safety. And there's a case that came out of Waltham and Lexington. It was on a property that bordered both, but in Waltham, called Tracer Lane, which essentially found that city, town, was unreasonably regulating solar, and they were not allowed to do that. It was fact-specific. It's not really the same as the issues that we have and what our solar addresses. But because 48 Section 3 says municipalities have to allow solar, you either have to allow it throughout town, or you can have an overlay district, but it's got to specifically say this is the only place in town where solar can go. So as far as 810 Wakeby, even if we got rid of the solar overlay district, it wouldn't have any impact on that project. So that project's not, they don't have, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't have a building permit yet, but they do have the special permit, and it was not appealed. I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. John?
Kate, that seems to me, I don't know maybe for sure, but that's a residential area, neighborhood where this solar array is being placed. Is that correct?
I'm going to defer to Jim specifically. I believe it includes residential, but it's more than that.
So that location currently is, for lack of a better term, a junkyard, but with a neighborhood directly abutting it. And part of the zoning amendment and the reason why this location required a special permit is that in the overlay district, and we talked about a little bit last time, it doesn't dissolve the underlying zoning. So the underlying zoning, the zoning district is residential. So because it's residential underlying zoning, it triggers a special permit as opposed to other locations in the overlay district that might be commercial or industrial, just are by right. So this would be the one location, or there might be a few others, but one location where it triggered this special permit.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering if these could be regulated to the point in the future that they're allowed only in industrial or commercial sites versus residential. If that's something we can say, okay, we'll give you a overlay, but it's not in somebody's neighborhood.
That's something that could be considered. We do want to keep in mind the ruling of Tracer Lane and make sure there's enough area in town, because that was one of the findings in that case, is that city, I believe Waltham's a city, didn't have enough area of town. The court never says what's enough, but they said what's not enough. So we'd want to make sure that we had enough percentage of land in town where it was allowed. But yeah, you could say that it's only allowed in these areas. And as
And-
Jim mentioned, that's always the case with solar, I'm sorry, not solar, with any overlay district. The overlay adds additional requirements, but it's still subject to whatever the underlying zoning is of the district, that's under the overlay.
Okay, I was just thinking that, can overlay districts be on top of buildings? Those be included? So if we have commercial sites or business districts, you could put them on the top of the buildings. It would be still preferable, I think, just having somebody in somebody's neighborhood, but don't know. That would also be private property, of course, so, yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, Mr. Moore had aptly mentioned, just want to highlight that the special permit was issued by the planning board a few years back. That's where this has come from. In terms of overlay district, it's the parcel lot. So whether there's, completely built out buildings or not, it would be applicable. And this actually doesn't touch on roof-mounted solar. That's a whole different category of use. This is large ground-mounted solar. The distinction might be a little gray at sometimes, but.
Kate, I apologize. I don't understand it clearly. I understand that the state has an overriding policy, solar, wind farm, et cetera. But it seems there was an amendment that was passed. We had solar overlays back, I think, 2007, Jim, is when we first passed that. And then there was a specific amendment that was particular to this 810 Wakeby Road project. When you say that a petition, the project can't be stopped, would the revoke, if you will, or the for that particular amendment, if that were to be, changed, would that stop the project? I'm unclear. If we had to have an amendment to make this possible under the state law, wouldn't the elimination of that amendment prevent that project from being built?
And by amendment, you're talking about adding the overlay, adding this project,
exactly. Right.
property to the overlay
Correct,
district?
yes.
The reason I'm saying that removing the overlay district wouldn't stop this project is because they could go anyplace else in town. Now, granted, they own this property and this is where they want to put it, but 40A Section 3 and the case law that's come from it does say that municipalities are limited in what they can regulate, and if it's not related to health or public safety, it can't be regulated. So
okay.
we have in place, the overlay district requires certain things, special permit, as Jim mentioned, and some other requirements. They could also, though, any applicant could come in and put solar any place in town. We probably need to tweak the overlay district language a bit. I believe the intention was to make it so that it limited where solar could go to just the overlay district, but it wasn't written that way.
Yep.
And therefore, we can't enforce it that way. So it is something that we're considering, which is what language could we put in that would make it stronger and make it fit the intent that
Okay.
we had when we adopted it.
I think that is, I think that's the objective of this group, is that the
Yep.
project goes somewhere else. It's not in their back, in their, right on their homes or residences. So, I mean, that might be acceptable to them. I don't know enough about it. I've made it clear to Ms. Salas that this committee doesn't have any authority to change the zoning or anything specific, but obviously it's a concern. We got a lot of letters from people. It's probably something we want to talk about, the solar overlay in general, but if they want to choose to, get information, and hopefully they're contacting you and Jim and whoever else is appropriate. I'm not sure of all the objectives and all the fine points, but it sounds like something they want to continue to pursue, so, okay.
Well,
Appreciate
it
that.
won't affect this project, which is why I asked what the goal is, but just rest assured that, if this committee recommends to the town council that we make a change, or even if you don't, we're already working on it internally. Legal is talking with planning about what we can do in terms of recommending an amendment.
Okay. Charlie?
Hi, Kate. Can you speculate, take a shot at this, and tell me what might have happened if the special permit had not been granted? Where would we be at right now?
Legally, that might be a better question for Jim to answer, but the case was settled essentially because a building permit could have just issued without the applicant complying with the terms of our solar overlay. So if the special permit hadn't issued, they wouldn't be able to go forward with the project, but it did, so, and it wasn't appealed, so that's not going to change anything.
So the appeal is something that it's too late to do an appeal?
It is too late. It's later than I thought, because Jim just mentioned that that was 2 years ago.
It was about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, so you have like 20 days to file an appeal under Chapter 48, Section 17, and that wasn't done.
So then these people have to live with this thing, with the noise and everything. That's
Well,
disappointing.
I don't know enough about the specific project to address those concerns, but that is where we are.
Okay, Ken?
This may just be sort of wishful thinking, but is it too late to, let me start over again. I went out to look at the property, found it very difficult to get anywhere near it so you could see what was going on in the property. But by looking at the aerial views, it clearly has had a lot of abuse over the last several years. It looks like it might be an appropriate place for a solar array. That might be an improvement. But the problem lies in the off-site effects that they're talking about, where they place the noise-making equipment, how close they are to some of the property lines, that sort of thing. Is there still the opportunity to adjust those components of the project itself?
I am going to defer to Jim on this because I don't know the terms of the special permit, but you can address things like that in a special permit.
Right, yes, and so to that point, when drafting the ordinance, that was kind of what was in mind is, how we as the town could minimize those types of disturbances if it was to be located in this general area. I will say it was before the planning board for 6 months or so. Multiple site walks with the board, them moving transmit or the fans and all that substantially away from residential areas, those types of things. I would say that the planning board worked hard to try and mitigate and minimize any kind of impacts that would have been created by this. But again, that was about a year and a half ago, and as Attorney Connolly mentioned, the project wasn't appealed in any form.
This may be something that the new inspector will have to make sure that they do what the planning board said to do.
Okay, it's okay. I just have a question. It's a follow-up
Kathy?
question. I just have a follow-up question, if I could. How many megawatts are we talking about here?
Don't have the decision in front of me. I want to say it's just over 5 megawatts.
5?
Yeah, I believe it was 5 megawatts. It's a large
Yeah,
amount of solar.
Yeah, right. Our role, I'm not sure the extent to which we can influence this, but our review of the solar part of the zoning ordinance may offer us opportunities to make suggestions for ways to look at this differently. One opportunity might be requiring certain buffer size around it if it's going to be placed in the middle of a residential neighborhood, or limiting the megawatts to only 1, let's say, in a residential district, just a suggestion.
Yeah, I say.
There's just opportunities to talk about it, to see if there are
Absolutely.
ways that we can manage this possibility coming forward again.
And I would say, properly putting that on the agenda would be good because it's about 16 pages. We put work with the planning board. They were the ones promoting the final product to town council, and they asked for a lot of additional protections, just like you mentioned.
Again, Steve Robichaud, Planning Board Chair. The only thing I'll mention is Karen Pina with the Planning Department does a great job of organizing all the minutes and the videos and all that. I definitely would encourage everyone to look at those minutes. You can reach out directly to Karen and say, can you let me know what meetings pertain to this topic? And she'll send you a perfect bulleted list of that. And I definitely recommend at least look at the minutes. If not, watch the videos. Public comment is essential, integral, but I don't want anybody to just look at the public comment and take that as a full picture of what's going on, because the meeting minutes and video has a lot more substance there. We really dug into this, and a lot of our focus was how can we minimize the impacts of those abutters. They did some phenomenal public comment that we listened to big time. So I just want to put that out there. Those minutes are critical to read to get a full picture of how this process unfolded. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Kathy?
Just a quick follow-up. So I don't have all the history of this particular project, so I don't want to speak out of turn about it in particular, but it brings up an interesting point in my mind with respect to enforcement. And one of the questions that I'm always making lists of questions, before we come to the meeting. So one of my questions was, is there a section of the zoning ordinance that penalizes isn't the right word, which does not allow a property owner to damage or otherwise degrade their property in anticipation of a future development project. So let's just say, as an example, I own 5 acres of land. It's a beautiful treed space. It has no conservation protections. It doesn't have any wetlands going through it. So and I own that property. And let's just say over a period of 10 years, I cut down all the trees and degrade the property. It becomes a dump zone. And I decide I want to build a parking garage there, right? Is there anything in the zoning ordinance that says I can't degrade my property prior to the actual formal filing of an application for development?
I don't think there's anything specifically telling people not to degrade their property, because I don't think that's something people typically do. But I do know that other regulations, such as conservation, will preclude people from being able to just rip trees down. We've taken enforcement action against people that have done that. But it has to be, it's either got to be protected land somehow, or it's got to be near wetlands.
Right.
And there are restrictions against.
That's why I was saying,
Yeah.
let's just assume it doesn't have any of those
Right,
protections
right.
on it. And I own the property, I cut down a couple of trees this year so I can sell the wood because I don't have a job and I need to, I'm kind of making it up as I go. But I know that in other localities where I've reviewed projects, there are enforcement actions that can be taken against a property owner who preemptively clears the land or otherwise degrades it in anticipation of a development project being submitted 10 years after I cut the trees down, just as an example.
We do have a lot of requirements in our zoning ordinance for things that are allowed and not allowed on property. So if a property they're doing a tree cutting business in a residential zone, the town will take enforcement action against them. Or if they're accumulating too many vehicles and for a home office, that's not allowed. There's very strict requirements of what you can do if you have a home office or home occupation that's allowed. So there are specific things that can be enforced again, but there isn't something just generally in all the districts that says you've got to maintain your property in a nice fashion or anything to that effect that I'm aware of.
John?
Thanks, Bob. Kathy's question is not out of line, because I've actually had experience with this in our village, where a developer was letting a property go downhill, putting illegal businesses in that property, and then dumping at the middle of the morning, like 3 o'clock in the morning, landscape trash and other things. It was in a wetland, okay, and when the owner was asked about, from one of the property owners nearby, would you mind stopping dumping at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning? And he said it could get worse. It could get worse. And this was at the time when the developer was trying to develop the property. Okay, that's not the first time in this particular case. So it's not so far afield as what we're talking about. So that comes down to enforcement of zoning and enforcement of dumping. There was reports that heating oil from old tanks was being buried in that spot, and actually the court went out and looked for it. So it does happen. So maybe we should look in, think about the possibilities.
Right. You just mentioned something else, so that it wouldn't be zoning, but it definitely would be regulated under our various health ordinances.
Yes.
And we have I've been involved here in some enforcement actions for things like that, because dumping of waste or oils, things like that,
Yeah.
Board of Health regulations, but also Department of Environmental Protection state regulations would govern that. So there are ways that we can take enforcement action for things like that, and people allowing their property to become degraded. Not necessarily zoning, but some zoning and some of the health and environmental regs as well.
I just think we ought to think about that a little bit closer, because it does happen. I know it for a fact. Okay, thanks.
Charlie?
I have these jets that fly over my house. It's noisy, and it's noisier than I wish it would be. The new runway, and the big JetBlue and American. They go over and almost shake the windows. My house, but in 15 seconds the noise is gone. And so I think about a project like this, and I think to myself, would I like that project next to my house? And I say no. I wouldn't want to have all that noise. I don't care how low the noise is or where the stuff is located. If there's noise, that's just something I wouldn't do to people.
Kristen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, Cindy, if you could reach out to Karen Pina and have her share with us that bulleted list of meetings, just so we're not all poking around and we can get that information as quick, just concise.
I'll reach out to her and have her put a list together for you, and I'll send the links to all of you so that you don't have an inundation of paper, but you can watch the actual physical links.
Thank you. And I appreciate, Attorney Connolly, the work that you've done and the work that the other people have done. And I know it was kind of a situation where we kind of needed to get our ducks in a row, but I think, like Charlie says, we need to think more proactively now, because there might be other people that want to do this, and it could be coming to a neighborhood next to you. And if we have an opportunity to exceed what we've already done, if what we did was really good, maybe there's some tweaking and we could exceed the expectations to, again, protect the value of our homes, because I feel for these people. The value of their homes is considerably lost. And that's kind of a little bit on us as people that work and run the town. So, but I get it. The state sometimes supersedes what we as townspeople want to have in our town. I mean, it's kind of like wind farms and substations. We don't really get a choice in a lot of those things. But if there's any choice we have, let's get that together and get that on the books so that we can protect our residents' home values and their quality of life, because I think that's part of the charter here, is the quality of life in our town. So, thank you.
Just thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve, for bringing that up, and we'll get that from you, Cynthia. That'd be great, because I think when we get to that topic, we'll delve into that a little bit more detail, and again, if not for this specific project, looking to the future, so, okay. Any other questions for Attorney Connolly? No? Thank you.
Okay.
I think we'll move to item G, which was going to be discussion for topics for September 6th and September 20th. And just a reminder, those meetings will start at 3:30. And I think we'll try and start them all from 3:30 going forward, but I'm sorry for any confusion today on that. Jim, I guess I'll ask you maybe just to help a little bit there. I know we've talked about a few things. One would be perhaps a joint meeting with LCP and housing. We talked about having, if not the developers, some of the attorneys, engineers in. Several of us were at the LCP meeting last night, the local comprehensive plan, and I know I had a couple comments from members of that committee saying, geez, you know, we were really just now becoming aware of what you guys are working on and the fact that there's an overlap in some of these issues. And, you know, I made some brief comments beforehand, just the importance of not working in silos, that we need to be aware of these issues, all the committees. So if not necessarily coordinating our conclusions, but at least being aware of them. So, and then we also talked about a presentation by Mr. Florence on enforcement. So I guess I'll toss it out to you, Jim, and maybe we won't have all the details for those 2 dates, but those are the things we're thinking about. You and I can maybe talk and, you know, come back with a proposed schedule for others.
Yeah.
Again, I think the issues as we get into the specific topics, and we touched on these last time, the form-based code, solar overlay, ADUs. I think another big one that we didn't really talk about much before, but it came out to light really last night in the LCP, is the whole single-family residential zoning, discussions about that, and then short-term rentals, and then the enforcement. So I look at those as kind of being 6 key topics that we'll delve into in the next 2 months, if that makes sense. I'm open to any other thoughts, suggestions. Kathy?
So I have a couple of ideas. So I started trying to read the zoning ordinance. It's kind of dense and a little difficult to get through. It's a real understatement. But I'd like to understand exempt uses a little bit better. What are they? What are the exempt uses? Because there are specifically identified exempt uses that don't have to follow the zoning ordinance. And I'd like to understand what they are and what was the thought process behind exempting them. I think that would be really helpful to understand.
Just to clarify, at the local level, or are we talking things like the state level Dover Amendment?
Oh, local level,
Okay.
local
Yep.
level, yeah, local level, yeah. The other thing that I thought about is, as I was reading the ordinance, I don't see schools mentioned anywhere. Is schools considered a municipal use?
An exempt use, yes.
Okay, so is there another set of rules and regulations that municipal uses need to follow?
Technically, municipal uses are exempt, but we try to, depending on the use, we do follow the underlying zoning, but things like, say, pump stations, no, you know, those have to be engineered and located in proper locations
Oh,
for.
I understand. What I'm thinking about in particular is, and I feel strongly about this, I think the town uses of land should set an example for good land use practices. And so exempting municipal uses without a specific set of written guidelines, I guess, sends a very important message to developers as they're looking through the zoning ordinances and trying to comply. Oh, wow, the town is exempt from all of that. Why should I do it? I should seek an exemption from that too. It just, it sends a message that that good land use practices are not written down for you, therefore they're not important. And I think it's important just to sort of keep in mind, and I'm not being critical of anybody, please know that, that if it's not written down, then it really, and you, Jim, as the director, new director of planning and development, you're going to follow certain practices that are really good practices that you know, but those will only serve your term as you're here 25 years from now. After you're retired, those will be gone. So what is the legacy? So that's why I'm kind of going at what are the written guidelines that you're following for municipal uses to make sure that the land use decisions, including things like stormwater management, solar on the roofs, telecommunications equipment on the roofs, in order to sustainable land use practices is what I'm getting at. So I don't know if that's important to anybody to understand that. It just seems to me like the town ought to be setting an example for good land use practices.
Yeah,
I'd love
maybe
to
that's-
know more about that.
Add that to a topic, maybe, Jim, when we get to some of the specific topics there, so.
Schools are important too because land use decisions that we're making on school properties are setting an example for the students that are going to see, they're going to see that. So in many ways, we're teaching the students about good decision-making around land use practices around the school properties. Those are our future residents, right? Future leaders. We need to be making good decisions that they can see. So that was just one of my ideas. How are school properties managed? And how does that relate to the zoning ordinance or any other set of guidelines or rules that are being followed by the schools? And are those written down so that they're followed in the long term?
Kristen?
I'm just curious, Jim, because every time I go to an LCPC meeting, I get seriously turned around and confused, and I feel like the thread is not, the tapestry is being woven, and it's just a big ball of yarn, and I don't know what's going on. But I know that land use is addressed in the LCP, correct?
Yes.
So when we discuss land use, as far as the LCP's discussion, that's just in a broader sense everywhere. It's not broken down into municipal and private land. It's just in generality.
No,
Would that somehow somewhat cover what Kathy's talking about?
Let's say an action could be to create good policies for municipal improvements. Certainly could be something. We do touch on facilities. There's a chapter in the LCP. The LCP is only land use, actually. So other aspects are you dive into other plans, such like strategic plan for town council, for instance. But yeah, the LCP is only land use. And yeah, we do touch on municipal facilities, though it's not like the top interest of everyone, but that could certainly be an action strategy that is created through that process.
And I guess my thought is kind of in one of the discussions last night was, is knowing what we have as a municipal body, what lands we have, drives what we're going to do for zoning and drives what we're going to do for housing. And we kind of need to know that piece of information. Like I said last night, it's great to think that we have a piece of property at Marston's Mills School, but what is the land use policy that's going to drive some of those decisions, because that is municipally owned? I think that's kind of what Kathy is saying. And where are those pieces? What is the comprehensive plan for our town as a whole, knowing we have a finite piece of land here that we need to kind of manage 10, 20, 30, 50 years, 100 years. So I guess I'm kind of seeing the thread of what Kathy is saying, along with the LCP.
John?
Thanks, Bob. Jim, this might be also a question for Kate. You might have already known that I think the legislature in Massachusetts has restricted or removed the ban on the requirement for ADUs to have an owner occupied. A lot of us fought to have that here, and now we'd like to know what the implications of that and what possibilities we have to work around it. Not work around it, but I'm saying work with it at this point. If it's the law, we've got to work with it. But that sort of makes a big difference as for how these properties are used, especially by investors who won't live here and will maximize the opportunities to make that a rental property. And I think that has implications for what we're talking about for housing and also for quality of life in neighborhoods and that kind of thing. So I think maybe if you have a chance to do a little bit of footwork before we start talking about that, because there'll be something that's coming up, and I don't see it as a positive for our community at this point, because there's nobody responsible actually living at the dwelling at that point.
Exactly. We once the housing bill was passed, we began to analyze what was passed versus what was locally accepted. And you're absolutely right. That's one of the main discrepancies between the state and our local ordinance. So we are discussing with legal what the ramifications are. Do we have to amend ours? And if so, what's the process? What should we, or how should we do that? So there will be more discussions. There are some other small tweaks, but that is primarily the biggest thing that we see as the difference. And we'll be talking with legal and getting you
Okay.
town council.
I appreciate that,
and
because that'll be coming up. That'll be a big topic, I'm sure.
Understood.
And we should have some background on it. But thank you for doing that.
You must have been channeling us, John, because we talked about that last meeting too, just to bring that up. So, no, just, that's great. We don't want to let that slide, so. Any other comments? Okay, I think, just kind of summarizing, I think from today's takeaways, Jim, I think on the memo, I think about things that we talked about, maybe including some language that makes the conditions, the importance, the fact that the conditions survive after the 10-year agreement, as well as the consideration of maybe the development or use of some sort of a template for regulatory agreements. Those are the two kind of things that I think came away towards the revisions to the memo. I think, in my mind, and correct me if anybody's wrong, I think we're coming to kind of a close of the regulatory agreement. Mr. Moore, you may have a few more comments, and I know I'm going to work with Jim on some of the questions you had. But I think with those, other than a meeting we might have with some of the developers, attorneys, engineers, which may be a joint meeting, I think that'll be feedback that may have some input. But I think we're getting close to the regulatory agreement topic closing. Anybody agree, disagree, or more thoughts on that? Kathy?
I don't want to close it completely
No,
because
absolutely not, yeah.
we may have one of those light bulb moments. And I don't want to miss out on the opportunity for improvements. We're always looking to improve, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, the intent was not to close it, but I would like to start thinking about, for those next two meetings, and again, Jim, maybe you and I can talk a little bit about how we do that, but again, whether we have, I think we could have a whole meeting if we were to get some folks from the LCP and housing, we could have a single meeting just to discuss some of these topics. You know, that, or we have, maybe we start with our first topic on zoning, and we talked about this, maybe giving us all a primer on form-based code, just to start to understand that. I know there's been lots of people, both town officials and others, say there's already tweaks that people can think of that we ought to be looking at. You and I talked about some of those, Jim, but I think maybe that would be helpful, whether it's at our meeting on the 6th, to maybe start talking about that. And then later on, we'll talk about the solar overlay and single-family residential and things like that. But does that sound like a good topic maybe to start thinking about for our next meeting? And then also the invitation to Mr. Florence to come in and give us a presentation on zoning. Those are kind of my, enforcement, excuse me. Those are my general thoughts. Open to any other suggestions folks have. No? Anybody? Okay.
Shall I work with Mr. Florence to see what his availability is, and I can fit in around his schedule.
Yeah, we want to be considered his schedule. Tell him that the 6th and the 20th, if one of those works better for him, we can get him scheduled, and then we can kind of work around the other pieces.
Will do.
And then as Jim and I come up with kind of a proposed schedule, I can ask Cynthia to send that out to the committee and make sure everybody feels comfortable with that. That sound good? And as always, Mr. Robichaud, you are welcome, and we're happy to have you join us for those meetings. So, thank you. Okay. All right. So I think we can move to, and again, just a reminder, it'll be 3:30 on the 6th and the 20th. Move to H, which is an approval of the minutes of August 16th, 24. Have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Then, again, next meeting will be September 6th at 3:30. Other than that, any other questions? Motion to adjourn? Seconded?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Great. All right, thank you, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you on the 6th.